And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, thanks for joining me. My guest is Daniel Greenfield. He's a Shillman Journalism Fellow at the Freedom Center. He is an investigative journalist and writer focusing on the radical left and Islamic terrorism. Daniel, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. My pleasure for having me back.
Now, Daniel, your latest article here, Fake News, Cops Hunt for Pull Ropes, Pinatas, and Swing Sets. You know, it's starting to look an awful lot like the Salem witch trials of 1690s, where you have people running around and authorities on this goose chase to find a racist incident. And, with the media jumping in and hyping it and signing up and all the rest. So talk a little bit about this particular incident, and let's talk about this phenomena as well.
That's exactly what it looks like. And the extraordinary thing is, even when people come forward, even when Black people, Latino people come forward and say, this is not a noose, it's a swing set, it's a piñata, it's a bunch of exercise equipment, that's completely rejected. So the actual politicians, the white politicians will come, no, it's a noose. No matter what, it has to be a noose, because psychologically we require that this is a noose. What a witch hunt requires that we find a noose. It doesn't matter what people say. It doesn't matter what the reality is. We know that this is a witch. This is exactly what it's like.
Well, they don't care whether it is or not. They believe that this is a beneficial thing for their cause, and it's supposed to raise awareness that we are allegedly a nation that has institutional racism or systemic racism, which, of course, is something that I think quite presciently is being promoted at a time when we are approaching an election, with the kind of the subtext, the wink wink element to it, being that anyone that doesn't genuflect to the left is racist, and that as Biden himself said, if you don't believe in him, you're not really Black.
Yeah, it's very much, there's a kind of religious component. You said if you don't believe in him, you're not Black. Racism has become a kind of religion, and the only appropriate way to respond to this original sin of America, as the 1619 Project and Obama put it, is to go to the left. You have to vote Democrat, you have to vote for left-wingers, and you have to go even further now in atoning. You have to wash the feet of Black pastors or whatever other pseudo-religious rituals are now being carried out. But of course, the great sin is being a Republican, is supporting Trump, because that automatically makes you a racist.
Well, look, there certainly are racist or at least race-leaning attitudes in this country. I mean, we saw Senator Tim Scott say that he's been stopped near the Capitol building, and I don't doubt the fact that if you're Black and especially if you're a Black man, you have to be a little bit more cognizant when you're out there, because somebody might mistake you for someone who might be involved in crime. They're not, of course, dealing with the fact that there is a crime problem, and that it particularly affects the Black community, which is more victimized by it. Instead, they want to do things like rip the Black face off the pancake box, or rip this is their idea of combating what actually is a real issue. And, we could take a look at some of the racist policies that have brought us here, mostly leftist policies. But what do you think is their strategy at this point going forward?
As you said, there is a real problem, but there's a huge difference between a real problem and the ideological exploitation of a real problem. Thus, for example, you have such a real thing as poverty, but the whole infrastructure of Marxism with the ideology surrounding it, which of course claim that it's basically a perpetual phenomenon unless we completely reconstruct society, that's the ideological exploitation of a problem, and they're now doing the same thing with racism. So going forward, their insistence is that just as Marxism said that you can't just actually fix poverty by creating jobs, by increasing income, by increasing productivity. What they're saying is that you can't actually fix racism by, say, being less racist or by creating opportunities. No, you actually have to fix it through top-down government control, through completely reconstructing society, through indeed actually Marxism tried to fix the so-called class problem by creating a much bigger class problem with a small slice of people at the top and everybody else at the bottom. They're doing the same thing with a totalitarian system where you're going to fix racism with a whole lot more racism. This has been their strategy from the very beginning: affirmative action, assorted racial privileges, creating more and more racial divisiveness. And again, we can see it working because when you look at the polls from the early aughts, most people thought, black and white, that race relations were pretty good in America. Now most people think they're pretty terrible, and a lot of them are willing to endorse any crazy thing that the left proposes.
So they're taking a real sensitivity in the United States, which is racism. And certainly this country has a history of white supremacy, but largely that's receded, particularly since World War II and the return of black troops and the integration of the military and in culture with people like Jackie Robinson, integrating the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then you have to this day with the Civil Rights Act, of course, of 1965. You have the removal of official racism, and you have a rise of the black community into the middle class, into the upper classes, and you have extraordinary success, which they don't discuss. Yet, in spite of that, they want to bring back this old bugbear that somehow we're systemically racist, and they want to use that, as you say, Daniel, to introduce Marxism into our country. And I think this group called Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of it, and they say so quite blatantly on their website and in their information. They want to transform America, do like what Obama talked about. I mean, and these are all euphemisms for collectivism and Marxism. Now, what information do you have, Daniel, about this shadowy organization called Black Lives Matter?
So it definitely is quite shadowy. The infrastructure is a tad ambiguous because there's Black Lives Matter, there's the Movement for Black Lives, there are assorted, seemingly spin-off groups. Some of their funding transitions through the Ford Foundation, which of course is one of the major left-wing foundations in the United States, which have been helping them raise money. And we hear about corporations donating millions of dollars to Black Lives. Where that money is going becomes somewhat complicated. Even in private fundraising, for example, there were millions of dollars going to an organization that had a name that sounded like Black Lives, but was not actually Black Lives Matter. So it's kind of extraordinary that we're seeing all this upheaval being conducted by an organization where really we know very little about it. We know obviously its founders, Patrice Cullors, have come forward and said that they're Marxists. But realistically speaking, something this size is not being managed by those people. It's being managed by professionals. And this is really something we've seen going back a century when the communists would set up these complicated organizations. These organizations would then engage in social disruption, but it was hard to know who exactly was behind those organizations. And this organization, I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. Its so-called founders have said that they're Marxists. This is very much a radical organization with a radical vision for America. And just going back a little bit, it's important to understand exactly what they believe. People understand that, yes, they think we're racist. That's not quite it. We go back to the 1619 Project, and from a conservative standpoint, the problem is that they're criticizing America's founding. That's also not the complete picture. What they actually believe is that slavery never actually ended, segregation never ended, they just transitioned into modern institutions. Thus, when they talk about defunding the police, for example, they believe that white supremacist institutions have continued existing, and the police department is the modern institution of slavery. The police are the slave catchers. The prison system is slavery. Prosecutors and people called the police are participating in the system of slavery. So from their point of view, I mean, they're going after statues of Lincoln, for example. They're going after statues of Grant. They're going after statues of Union generals. They're going after the Glory Memorial. Why are they doing all this? They believe, of course, that all this was a lie. Slavery never actually ended. America has always been white supremacist. The only way to change and slavery is to eliminate whiteness. So this is really at the core of their creed.
Well, if they're defining slavery as the over-incarceration of black men, which, by the way, they do have a case there, then they might want to try to get rid of the Biden bill that was passed under the Clinton administration that made the three strikes law and that incarcerated hundreds of thousands of black men for minor crimes. They're quite right about that. Maybe they might support President Trump in his First Step bill, which released, I think it was upwards of 10,000 young black men from prison. Most of them were black, and continue with that kind of a reform. But of course, you're talking about something more systemic. You know, this Black Lives Matter thing kind of reminds me a little bit of Acorn. Now, Acorn was defunded as a result of an expose by Project Veritas back, I think it was in 2010, around that time. And what they discovered with Acorn was this beehive of interlocking organizations, some of them for-profit, some of them non-profit, many of them getting huge grants from the government. Others, work, they kind of like had interlocking directorates and interlocking employees. And their goal was to overthrow the country. It was based on the theories of Cloward and Piven, who wrote a very famous paper back in the late 60s saying that the way to bring about socialism and the way to destroy the American system was to overwhelm it, to overload it with either welfare applications, in their case, or fraudulent ballots to try to destroy the voting system. And in every election, they'd be caught engaging in all kinds of voter fraud. And Black Lives Matter is starting to look a little bit like that to me. We don't even know the beginning of it. It hasn't been investigated. We know that as a result of these killings in Minneapolis and in Atlanta, which were overreactions on the part of the police, they've used that as a way to get governments and private organizations and big firms like Quaker Oats and others to donate, I don't know, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to these people without anyone knowing exactly who's getting what. I mean, as if this is going to do anything to help any black person. I mean, other than maybe it's putting money in someone's pocket. And it stinks. It's a corrupt model. It's based on complete extortion. If a corporation doesn't cooperate and bow to Black Lives Matter, they're going to put up, they're going to boycott them. I mean, this is what Jesse Jackson is doing and Al Sharpton back in the 1990s and 80s.
It is the same thing on a whole bigger scale. So Acorn in practice was not actually defunded. The national organization was, but the local subcomponents of it remain quite powerful. And if you actually trace back Ocasio-Cortez's career, it goes back to a Acorn component. Now, this is very much, you've correctly identified, this is the kind of blackmail that Sharpton and Jackson were doing, except on a much, much bigger scale. This is not just on a national scale. It taps into a whole giant slice of corporate America. It taps into local chapters. If you think about the other half of what the defund police movement is about, yes, it's moving money away from the police, but it also moves money to their organizations. So when you have local cities passing measures to move millions of dollars or even $1 billion away from police budgets, the money is meant to go right into the pockets of the very people creating these riots. And part of the other thing is where some of the money is coming from corporate America, it's coming from corporations that are actually benefiting from this, particularly Amazon, some of the big tech companies, because they're very happy to see local retail decimated. These guys loot and burn stores. Amazon just strengthens its bargaining position. That's also part of what's going on. Forget the food desert, which they talk about occasionally. We're heading for a retail desert in which local retail is wiped out. Amazon, Netflix, a handful of companies that are really functioning as online monopolies benefit hugely in that regard.
That's right. And you take the combination of the pandemic and now this, where you have thugs, sort of the Democratic Party shock troops, to use a term Lenin used, out there burning black businesses, looting black homes, terrorizing black neighborhoods, killing black people, and all in the name of trying to bring about racial equality. And then they want to turn around and you get mainstream politicians, elected officials, big corporations, especially younger people for some reason, signing on to this idea that there is something good about defunding police departments, which really means ending police departments. These are people who live in the safe, predominantly white suburbs, who don't have to worry about violence, who aren't going to get caught in the crossfire of drug gangs. Here in Boston, many years ago, the young girl was a 12-year-old girl was killed sitting on the front stoop of her home because she got caught in the crossfire of two drug gangs on her street. You take away the police, I mean, that's going to be sheer terror in these cities. So they've already burning the cities. Now they want to take away the police and turn them over to terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Over the weekend, 3 children were shot and killed, I believe, in Chicago. The Black community is very heavily impacted by violence. When you actually look at what Black communities want, as opposed to Black Lives Matter, which is an organization that in no way represents Black people. I mean, it doesn't actually have a membership. Nobody voted for it. Black communities actually want more police. And Baltimore residents were complaining that there were fewer police on the street because they've got huge murder rates. When you there was a recent survey, actually, only 7% of Black people were very unhappy with their local police department. You mentioned the '94 crime bill. That was passed with the support of the Congressional Black Caucus. A lot of our tough on crime laws going back to the '60s were passed with the enthusiastic backing of Black communities, which wanted somebody to crack down on the pushers, to crack down on the junior generation of their neighborhoods. One of the great tragedies in America is really in the '90s, Black leadership shifted to people like Sharpton, people like Jackson, people who were not calling for fighting crime, people who were actually on the side of the criminals. Because up to then you had Black neighborhoods, you had Black ministers going out and pushing for tougher measures to fight crime. The NAACP back in the day had actually a whole crime study in which they sought tougher penalties. They wanted the death penalty, I believe, for drug dealing. So Black communities very much benefit from policing because when you actually pull out the police, what happens is that Black people are the ones being killed. Their kids are the ones being shot on front porches. It's now white kids who are being shot on front porches.
No, and of course that legislation was necessary, although I would argue it was too overbearing in that a lot of relatively minor crimes were caught up in it, and you ended up a massive expansion of prisons with people who might have been, smoking a joint or something, or selling a nickel bag to a friend. It wasn't, you know what I mean? It became like this kind of overreach as to a lot of bills, and it needed to be altered. And I think that's what President Trump is doing, and he's doing it with some bipartisan support in Congress. But meanwhile, we're facing an election, and this is the kind of propaganda that we're going to hear every single day. I mean, if you look at the mainstream media, without mentioning names, almost every story now is about how horribly racist the United States is. And you look at foreign media, they're looking, oh, the Americans hate, they're racist. And it's going to be a drumbeat that we're going to hear right up until the day of the election. And if Biden wins, then it'll probably stop the next day. Do you think that it's working for them? Do you think the American people are going to be taken in by this? Are they going to really create that kind of racial discord and racial animosity that they need to create in order to win?
Well, right now it's very much up to the Republican Party. The American people are hearing this drumbeat every day, and some people are falling for it. The poll numbers are mixed. American people do have decided that this is now a major issue, but on the other hand, they actually support action to bring the violence to heel. The larger problem is that the Republican Party has been silent or sending confusing mixed messages. The American people need to hear a clear voice and a consistent message, and they need to see action. They need to see pushback. When Republicans bow to this whole idea of systemic racism, when they bow to this myth that America is racist, then we automatically lose.
And they are bowing to it because they want it, because they want the same, they want to have the good and friendly coverage by the mainstream media. They get rewarded by going along with this, even though ultimately they're not going to be rewarded. They need to understand they might get 1 or 2 days of nice coverage, and then they're going to get shafted in the back the next day. So, you're not going to get the coverage that you hope for. You're not going to get, it's easy to go along with this stuff. You get the awards, and you get punished when you don't go along with it. I mean, they were making, for example, Vice President Pence on the national television. Would you say the words Black Lives Matter? And he didn't. Not because he doesn't think Black Lives Matter, but because he does not want to endorse this criminal organization that actually obviously doesn't give a damn about Black lives. Otherwise, they'd be talking about the 3 children that were just murdered in Chicago.
Yeah, it's absolutely outrageous. The bottom line, though, is that when Republicans remain silent, when they become complicit in it, the media, as far as coverage goes, exists for one purpose, which is to make the country more left-wing and to obviously defeat Republicans, which means trying to get good media coverage is never going to work. Thus, you have the absurd scene in the Senate where the Republicans put forward a so-called police reform bill and expected Democrats to sign on to it. And the Democrats are going to filibuster the bill and insist that they want much, much tougher bill. This is what happens when you try to play the game the way of the Democrats. It's never going to work. You actually have to take conservative positions. You actually have to stand for what's right instead of trying to find common ground with the left, because with this kind of radical left, there is no common ground. Just a little detour. In the latest protests in Madison, which were very ugly and violent, you had a Democrat state senator who went out and tried to take photos with the protesters. They beat him bloody. They left him lying in a heap on the pavement and to be taken away by an ambulance. This is what happens even to the left, who tries to align themselves with a radical organization, because these people genuinely are radicals. They're moving well beyond even where the Democrats are comfortable being, and the Democrats are tagging along after them. And worst of all, the Republicans are tagging along after the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones that looted the CNN headquarters in Atlanta. That's their best friend. Those are there's a scissors effect. They're the guys on the street agitating, and then you get the guys in the boardrooms at CNN helping from the comfort of their wealthy and posh suites. But yes, I mean, ultimately you're right. They're just radicals. They're Antifa. They want to have a communist revolution. I hope that they overplay their hand very soon. It looks like they are, in that it's going to cause a major wake up, because there's just no justification for this. Now, Daniel, there are the polls coming out. I don't believe them, but at the same time, they're pretty scary. They show President Trump 11 points behind, and they show what's even worse for me. And again, I don't believe it. I think that they're full of it, but you never know. It's all we have to go on. They show younger people under 30, massively abandoning President Trump and moving to the left. Do you sense that that's true? And if so, why, and what can be done?
Well, younger people tend to vote to the left anyway. That's been pretty consistent. The Republican Party support is based on older people. You need a certain percentage of young voters, particularly young white male voters. But the basic reality is that if you've got college graduates that are white male, white female, they are generally going to vote leftward. And President Trump is a harder sell for that demographic anyway. They could go out and vote for Mitt Romney. Trump really has succeeded by making inroads into traditional Democrat demographics, and that's really going to be the big test if Trump can get the economy working again. Now, as far as polls go, back in the day, which is really not all that long ago, polls used to be more accurate because the general sense was that you were as credible as your polls were accurate. These days, there are two markets for polls: internal polls for campaigns, and those polls have to be accurate because campaigns need accurate information. Then there's the media. Now, the media does not want accurate polls because the media at this point exists purely to manufacture political narratives. So the polls that succeed with the media are really the ones that tell the media what it wants to hear, and we all know what the media wants to hear. Now, there are still some credible polls out there, particularly local polls, but at the same time, it's very much a mixed bag, and you kind of have to be a data scientist to make any sense of which ones might be accurate, which ones might not be, and even then, you have to look at things like oversampling and all that. So I would not panic over polls. I mean, if we go to 2016, the polls were all showing that President Trump was going to lose. At the same time, there are basic problems. The coronavirus has ravaged the country. We have the riots that are now ravaging the country. Americans need another narrative, and they're really not getting another narrative very effectively and very consistently. Now, hopefully some of this fades as the summer continues, and President Trump is able to step up, show leadership, and actually take charge of the narrative. Because right now, the narrative, the one that we're hearing in the media, the one that really we're seeing on social media, is almost entirely driven by either leftist policies or reaction to those. Now, when Republicans are reactive, they lose. You can't actually win an election on reactivity unless people are just really, really sick of the other side, which is a possibility. But overall, you need to actually send another message. You need to have another vision. And that's really what elections come down to. There's a clash of visions, a clash of perspectives. If you're just depending on reactivity or depending on them to kick the bums out, that's really not enough, especially when Republicans control the Senate and the White House.
Well, I actually think that President Trump does have a positive message. I watched and listened to the Tulsa rally, and he had a lot of amazing things to say in that rally. Of course, the only thing that was covered by the media was the attendance, and we know that that was rigged anyways, and they're not going to say anything good. But if he gets his message out, I do think that it's one that's going to resonate with people, and that it is positive. The question is whether he can get it out. He's being censored on Twitter. I don't know if they're going to, and I think that these polls, they wanted to look like Biden's winning because they have to make it look like he's winning. They don't want this to, they want this to be a contested race, putting aside the fact that Biden himself, obviously there's something wrong with him. I mean, you can see anytime he even making his comment in his commercial that precedes this program, you can see that the man isn't stringing, everything isn't like functioning. There's like a couple of pickles short of a barrel. I don't want to be crude here, but the man is not, appears to be virtually incapacitated at this point, but that's going to be covered up. And I think that as the election nears, it's going to become more obvious and the polls are not going to be so great for him. And that's when I think things are going to get real, real ugly. We don't know. I don't know what they're going to pull off next, but they've already mishandled the pandemic, and they've tried to use that against Trump. Now you've got the race conflict. What are they going to pull out of the deck now?
I absolutely agree that President Trump has a positive message, but actually breaking through with it, having the focus and the messaging is a challenge. The Biden campaign is pretty much weekend at Bernie's. You have a hollow candidate, but they don't actually expect Biden on the campaign trail. They expect basically to fight this campaign in the media, and Biden is just a placeholder. He's obviously not mentally functional, which means what their job in some ways is actually easier. In the past, the actual Biden would have been a more controversial figure. At this point, he's just this kind of lovable grandpa who is completely out to lunch and can't finish a sentence, which from their point of view is an advantage. Because if you think about the 2012 Biden, the one who was saying stuff like, we're going to put you all back in chains and doing the really obnoxious debate with Paul Ryan, there's a plus and minus. That Biden was very active, but at the same time, he was off-putting. This Biden is just going to slowly go through a sentence that somebody else wrote down for him. And he's going to nod his head and say, that's it now. And some people are going to find this charming, and we're going to see very little of it. Biden campaign wants as few debates as possible. They may end up just deciding to cancel debates if there's some kind of coronavirus resurgence. Meanwhile, they're going to be pulling off one massive national crisis after another, and they're going to be expecting Republicans to react to it. That is really going to be the challenge going forward. Republicans are going to have to catch every ball that's thrown at them and throw it back.
I mean, I've heard rumors of China cooking up a new virus and sending it our way around the fall. I've heard things about snipers shooting people from the roof. I mean, I'm just saying it's going to get, downright revolutionary if Trump starts to win. And these are people who will do anything to stop Trump because Trump is going to put them in jail if he wins. I mean, he's moving in on this rotten, corrupt, what he calls, and I think accurately, deep state. And it is a kind of almost a war that's going on just under the hood a little bit from the view of Americans. But it is a fierce one, and they want to take him out, and it's a very dangerous time. Anyway, that's how I see it. Daniel Greenberg, I want to thank you, Daniel Greenfield, for joining me today. Let my viewers and listeners know where they can view your excellent articles and see what you're up to.
Well, you can find my work at Front Page Magazine, frontpagemag.com, at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'm a Shillman Journalism Fellow. I also have a site, danielgreenfield.org. And just one closing remark. For the stuff that they're going to pull, look for economic damage. The common denominator of the pandemic and the riots is economic damage. Their goal is to depress the economy.
Absolutely. All right, Daniel. Thanks so much as always. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks.